Hello, my name is Jim Hennager. I'd like to welcome you to Table Talk. This is an attempt to document some of the issues that are occurring in the world right now and maybe open up some discussion so that we can take a rational, reasonable kind of approach to the issues, not only here in the United States but around the world. I founded the New Independent Party, and I'm hoping that others will join with me to become involved in these kinds of discussions. And we're hoping to bring some new light to some of the very complicated issues that we're having today. Today is a very sad weekend from last Friday on the attacks in Paris, which killed many people, wounded many more. And what we're seeing in the news media today, on the mainstream media, the newspapers, television, and especially on the internet, is basically a call to arms. People around the world are saying we need to defeat, destroy ISIS. We need to put more troops into the Middle East, and we need to stop this before they basically have more attacks, and possibly attacks even here in the United States. And what we're seeing is that a group of people who usually are identified as war hawks are calling for an immediate response that would take more troops and more fighting in the Middle East, all centered around this new group called ISIS. I would urge some caution here because it's much more complicated than it appears. It's easy to see why people are emotional when there's blood on the streets, when there are people that have died that are completely innocent. It doesn't make any sense. And from one level, you can understand why people are wanting some kind of revenge, they're wanting some kind of an immediate response. But again, I urge that we look at this from what I try to do in my classes. I'm a professor. I've been teaching classes for over 30 years. I try to look at issues from as many sides as possible, looking at it historically, looking at it politically, economically, try to understand where people are coming from different directions, and then try to put together possible solutions. When you look at ISIS, for example, the first thing that you have to kind of come to an understanding is that ISIS came out of nowhere and has come very fast, and to assume that these people that are running this are idiots or have no understanding of what the consequences are of what they're doing is really very naive. It certainly appears that the people who have organized and supported ISIS from its beginning are very well organized, very knowledgeable about technology, very knowledgeable about the media, social media, and then very knowledgeable about the consequences. Almost everything they've done, they have wanted some kind of social response, and that is where you have to be careful, because it would appear that there may be levels of things going on here that would allow basically a very small group to manipulate a lot of people very quickly. And by that I mean the kind of response that comes out of this event may well be much worse or very directed at some influences that many people aren't really considering. It is complicated, and I don't want to get into some of the controversies around how ISIS was formed and who supported it, who's put money into it, who's given them the technical support. But I think we're going to find out in the long run that American interest in organizing this group is there, along with other Middle East countries. I think we've trained them. I think we've supported them. And to think that we can now go in and change the course of what's happening there by military action, I think is naive. I think we have to understand the big picture and what is actually going on here before we determine, exactly what would be appropriate. The other side of this is I see in American culture, for example, and probably somewhat European culture, we have a tendency to think of the Middle East as being backward or not as advanced, that they are just warriors without a cause. And I think this is a very misleading kind of assumption to make. If you look at history, the Middle East has produced a number of very advanced civilizations, going back to the Sumerians and the Mesopotamian area. We've seen the Persian civilization in the past. We've seen one civilization after another come out of the Middle East. They developed alphabet and numerals. They had advanced technology 10,000 years ago. So without that kind of understanding of history, I think we're too quick to assume that what's happening in the Middle East today is a result of their educational level or their intelligent level, or that they're barbarians in some way. I think that's all very misleading. And many of the circumstances of these countries in the Middle East go back to some of the events that happened after World War II. The Germans occupied almost all of this area, and when the war was over, it was left up to the British government in large to create the boundaries and the countries that came out of the Middle East. Some of these were brand new countries, and if you look at the history of it, you can see that the British interest in many of these boundaries was deliberate to keep them weak. For example, Iraq. They knew, the British knew, that there were three dominant kinds of Muslim groups there in the region, and so by putting the boundaries such that all three of them were in one country, Iraq, I think they deliberately wanted to keep it weak. Why would they want it to stay weak? I think the answer to that is they could see that someday there would be a rise of interest in maybe recreating a new civilization or a new power base, and they could tell that there was going to be an interest in oil. So in some of these countries, the British interest and American interest was there as well. We're to go back to feudal kind of tribal control, and as a result of that, some of the countries ended up having kings, which we still have those today. Why didn't they go to democracy back then? That's a very good question. And it would appear that expediency, maybe, trying to work with the kind of power units that were there, was easier at the time. There wasn't any real emphasis to bring democracy and capitalism into the Middle East in the 50s and 60s. And so what we got were a lot of tribal kinds of conflicts. We have nation against nation, and crossing over that are these religious interests between the Shiite, the Kurdish, and Sunni kinds of religious background, plus some very isolated groups off of those main religious sects that have come forward, and some of these go back hundreds and hundreds of years, so that nothing's really new here in the Middle East. A lot of this history goes back to conflicts that go all the way back to Sumerians and Persian and some of these kinds of power exchanges through the last 2,000 years. But what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan comes down to some decisions made in the 80s and 90s, and particularly since 2001, that in Afghanistan, what you saw was a new kind of government that came in there in the early 80s, was socialistic, and they were having problems because some of the tribal leaders in Afghanistan weren't interested in that kind of government. And so it's well known that the Afghan government at that time invited the Russians to come in to help stabilize. Well, the Russians apparently were more than eager to do that, or certainly were willing to, and they were looked on by particularly the Taliban and some other resistance groups there as being invaders. We certainly have painted them as being invaders into Afghanistan, and that was the reason why we developed $500 million in secret expense accounts to create resistance groups there in Afghanistan, and some of those, we knew that we were creating groups that were going to fight the Russians, fight against some of the tribal kinds of influences that were going on there. In fact, it's reported that the whole name Al-Qaeda actually came from an American newspaper. It wasn't even their idea, but people like bin Laden and other resistance groups were obviously supported and paid money and given a lot of support, including a lot of surface-to-air missiles that, interestingly, the history of that comes that they were Russian missiles that were purchased in cooperation between the Mossad of Israel and the Egyptian military. So, a very interesting irony. You have Russian surface-to-air missiles being smuggled into these resistance groups, and they start shooting down helicopters and planes to the point where the Russians thought it was too expensive to stay there. A lot of irony there. Now, those groups that became known as Al-Qaeda, they expected a continued support level from the United States after the Russians left, but it didn't happen. So the Americans basically set these groups up, they supported them, they trained them in many cases, and then they basically dumped on them. And that created a lot of resistance to the American influence, and a lot of feelings of disappointment, and to the level that they probably were very angry at the U.S. So you have that whole thing festering there in Afghanistan, and then after 9/11, you can look at 9/11 any way you want to, but it's highly doubtful that bin Laden was behind 9/11. You really have to stretch it to think that somebody in a cave in Afghanistan can pull that off. But he took credit for it and then basically got blamed for it. And that's probably how it's going to go down in history. But at the time, after 9/11, there probably weren't more than several hundred members of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. But we went to war. I mean, we took our boots and we went in there, and we've been there ever since. And what have we accomplished? I mean, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, and people have been forced to leave Afghanistan. And really, we don't have any kind of stability there, even to today. If you take Iraq, if you looked at Iraq in 2002, 2003, when we decided to invade that country because they had weapons of mass destruction, which we never found. Again, we went into a country that at that time, under Saddam Hussein, had no resistance groups, no terrorist groups. There was no Al-Qaeda. And look at it today. It's rampant with resistance groups and different tribal kinds of interests. And ISIS was able to come in within a matter of months and basically take over 1/3 of it. So, you have to look at this from a wider picture than just your emotion of yesterday. you have to look at what was really going on in this country historically and what the role of the United States has been. We're not exactly the white hat people there in the Middle East. We have vested interest, which almost always comes out to be commercial interest, oil industry or natural resources or whatever it might be. But obviously, when we say we're there to protect our interest, it's not necessarily security interest, it's almost always commercial interest. And because of that, the rest of the world has been very careful about identifying us as being the white hats in this region. And many people, quite honestly, see us as being the evil empire in the Middle East. And particularly with this development of ISIS. It would appear that the origins of this came out of some of the worst prisons in Iraq. And it would appear that CIA and military people identified key people in these prisons who were basically fighting Americans in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and they made them a deal. They would give them training and they would give them support if they would form a resistance group and basically attack the Syrian Assad. And it appears that that's how it was originally put together. We know that there were training grounds in Jordan and Saudi Arabia, and this ISIS got started basically with our support. So we have to be careful when we turn around and say, wait a minute, we got to go in there and destroy them, particularly if it was an organization that we were involved in creating it. Now, some would say, well, we helped create it because we had a mission in Syria to overthrow Assad, but now it's gone beyond that, and they're independently creating havoc, and that we've lost control of that. On the other hand, if you look at this like a Rubik's Cube, you can see that they may still be connected to our influence, and the reason might be that some people in this developing strategies to keep the Middle East weak would argue that the best way to keep them weak is to have them keep fighting each other. And by creating ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all the other kind of groups that are there, they're going to always be very weak. And as long as they're weak, two things benefit the United States. One is it creates an environment of military need, and so those people in the military-industrial complex are sitting there saying, hey, this is exactly what we want to have happen. More boots, more guns, more ammunition being sold, and countries at war with each other. Now people would argue that that's not the mission of the United States military, but to be quite honest, it certainly appears that is dominant. We've been at war almost every year since the Constitution was put together in 1776. I don't think there's been more than a dozen years that we haven't been at war. And the influence of the military-industrial complex is very strong here. Just look at the 110,000 different companies that were involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the support that they gave through campaign donations to congressmen who supported it for this long. It's absolutely crazy to think that the United States couldn't defeat Afghanistan, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, in a matter of months. So the war wasn't the problem. It was, what do you do after the battle? But here, we don't even have control of Afghanistan, and we've never really had control of Iraq. It has to be looked at as a duplicity here of continuing the war to continue spending. And we've been spending this money that we didn't have. I mean, the spending in the Middle East on Afghanistan and Iraq have probably produced $1 trillion of our national debt in the last decade. So I don't think we're being rational or reasonable if we don't look at all of the big picture here. It could very well be that people behind ISIS at the top are using these people, at the bottom, suicide bombers being promised that they'll go to nirvana or heaven and have 100 virgins. That's sort of a terrible kind of strategy to use on young people to get them to commit suicide. But at the lower levels, that may be what's going on. But at the top levels, these people are very aware of the kind of consequences that they would have, and having more countries like France and Great Britain and more countries like Turkey get involved in this war is good for military business. So I caution you to be very careful about jumping to conclusions here without knowing all of the facts. And I would think that we need to look at a bigger solution to this whole Middle East, besides trying to divide it up and keep it into turmoil. So I think one direction that we need to look at is how can we bring up the economic level of all these countries, all these people, bring up the education of all these people, rather than basically keeping them in 1,000 years in history. So again, I think there are better ways to look at this over the long run, and jumping into the Middle East with some very quick responses, I think might be creating a prelude to World War III. I don't think that's off the table. We're talking about some giant situations here that could go anywhere, very quickly. And I would urge caution, I would urge reasonableness, rational kind of thinking here, and really what we need to do is get people around a table and get them to talking, which I have not seen, and I think that's the big problem here. We need to communicate, we need to try to understand each other's side, and we need to be more transparent about our interests there and what we hope to come out of there with. So again, this is Table Talk. I appreciate your listening. Thank you.